Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. You guys know what time it is. Time to talk about current events in the online fitness community, and a number of my subscribers have linked me a video from a guy called SuperHuman. I've covered a couple of his videos in the past, and I really want to make this a learning lesson because there's some major physiology problems in here. And he did a video explaining how to develop the inner chest, and he has these special exercises for it. And here's what people need to understand. I don't care what your training goals are. I don't care whether you're strength or performance oriented like me and big chunk of my subscribers here, or whether you're chasing the aesthetics thing or the bodybuilding thing or whatever else. There are basic laws of physiology in the body that have to be followed and understood. Otherwise, it's going to be harder for you to reach your goals, and you're going to fall into silly nonsense that people put out there. And I'm not saying that necessarily everything this guy says is wrong. I'm not saying everything he says is nonsense, because obviously it's not. So I do want to admit that. It's not like everything he says in his videos is wrong. This particular video is way wrong, and it just has to do with understanding basic physiology. And he's basically has special exercises to bring up the inner chest. All right, here's what people need to understand. We all have lagging muscle groups. And again, goes back to my point. I don't care whether it's a performance issue, whether it's an aesthetics issue. Every single one of us have a lagging muscle or muscle head somewhere, or if not multiple of them in our bodies, that we do need to bring up from time to time to help us reach our goals. Even I, as a strength athlete, I have weaknesses right now in my musculature that I'm working on and putting extra work into because I know it will help me improve my bench press. I know it will help me improve my squat. And we have to be aware of how these different muscles work, because if we don't, how are we going to possibly bring up our weak body parts? And it's like the other day, Scott Herman did a video, and I covered that one, where he was talking about people putting out silly exercises that don't really do what people want them to do, and they'd be better off sticking to basic exercises or time-proven things to even correct weak points. And you have the case here of SuperHuman You saying that, hey, it's hard to build that area, but I want you guys to notice something. Why does he have a well-developed inner chest? Do you really think it's these special exercises, or do you think it's because his whole chest is big? The guy has a pretty big chest, right? He's not lacking in his pec department. The entire thing is big. The outer edge is big. He's at a low body fat. All right, that's usually what it takes to build your inner chest. And I want to make that clear, and I'm going to get over to the different parts of the chest in a minute. But you have to understand there are different parts of the chest that can be emphasized to some extent with different exercises. No one's arguing against that. But they tend to be proximal and distal, not medial and lateral. All right? You can't actually work your inner chest more than your outer chest, and vice versa. You can't do it. Now, people are going to say, Jason, don't you say that the longer range of motion matters, that there's muscle fibers, whether it's bench press or anything else? Don't you always say that in order to work all the available muscle fibers, you have to do the full range of motion? Yes. And so doesn't it stand the reason that there are muscle fibers that are only worked at the bottom, and there are muscle fibers that are only worked at the top? Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's absolutely true. And I'm not going to argue against that point. In fact, we're going to reemphasize that point. But it doesn't mean that they're inside to outside. In other words, when you look at the way the pec contracts, it basically does this, right? This is what your pectoral does. You do know that at every point in this range of motion, there are muscle fibers all the way across retracting, or contracting, right? That's part of what they do. And so the top of the movement doesn't work the inner part more, doesn't work the outer part more. That's not how the pec works. They're a line of muscles. They all insert into a point up here, and then they fan out towards the chest. And that's the reason we can get some of this up to down, right? That can affect it high and low, right? As far as our angle. So the angle down here, 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 right? That affects it. And it will affect top to bottom to some extent. And there are certain positions, even that are in the middle, that will work the top and bottom more. Right? We know that floor presses, for example, seem to, at least in EMG data, hit the upper chest a lot harder than a normal flat bench does. Yeah? We're all familiar with that, right? Because there's some different things that happen with the muscle fiber recruitment. But just like when we talk about the bicep, you don't work the upper and lower bicep more, right? Because it's a line of pull. So think about it that way. There might be different heads left to right on it, but if you look where they insert, that's the same as like this, right? So now see that line of pull tendon to tendon? That makes sense. You guys get that, right? Well, it's the same here to here. And what ends up happening is that, yes, the very top, because we have the most tension on the muscle at the bottom, that's the hardest part, we do generate more work at the bottom on like a bench press or anything else, right? And it gets easier as we go up. And yes, there are people who have a lacking chest who might need to do some smaller exercises. Do you know why? Because maybe their chest doesn't get fully developed. Maybe there are some people who they need a little bit more chest stimulation because their chest doesn't respond as well to presses. Maybe it's a lacking body part, just like for me, generally my triceps are the weak link in my bench press. I have to do extra tricep work. We are all a bit different there, and different weak points are going to develop over time. But that means that you just need to do some extra smaller work for it. If your chest is lagging and everything else, your triceps and delts and everything else are growing, there's probably things you need to adjust in your bench press. There's probably, you might even need to do a smaller exercise. You might even need to do a single joint type fly type movement. I'm not going to argue against that. There are definitely cases for that, even though I'm not always a big fan of smaller exercises. I'll admit, hey, if everything else is growing and your chest is your weak point, even in your bench press as a power lifter, you might even need to do some small exercises for your chest, right? I'm not going to argue against that. If it is what it is. But what you need to understand is that just because it's easier at the top doesn't mean you're not working, because you know why? You fatigue fibers at the bottom. Your chest is still at the lockout up here, is still being worked really, really hard on a wide grip bench press. You can still build a massive chest doing that, or an incline bench. But you can't work the inner or outer more. If your inner chest is lagging, there's usually only two things causing it. Either your chest as a whole isn't big enough, or you got too much fat covering it. That's the reason you can't see that ass chest a lot of these guys want, right? A lot of these guys are chasing, as Omar Issoff puts it. It's because you need bigger pecs. And if you do anything that makes the outer grow, the inner's going to grow also. You can't change the proportions on the chest like that. It's a body fat issue. If your outer chest is really big and you still don't have the inner chest that you want, I can promise you it's a body fat issue. Or some guys, they're eventually you get it so big that you can still see that even through their body fat. But those are guys who have massive chests. You guys who bench 500 plus pounds, even when they're at 20% body fat, you can still see that sometimes. But it's because their chest as a whole has gotten that big. And people need to understand that you can't bias the inner or outer chest. And some people will say, well, how come I feel it more on a closed grip? Well, think about it. You're moving it through a longer range of motion, right? So you are fatiguing fibers differently. You're getting a deeper stretch. But you get the same thing probably if you did an incline bench. And when you come up with a closed grip, what are you doing? You're actually pressing your arm, your bicep presses against your chest. You're actually pushing against the chest. That's the reason you feel it a little more at the top. With that, it's not working the muscle fibers harder when you squeeze up at the top. What are you doing? You're pressing against the sides of your chest, so you end up feeling your pecs more. But that's not the muscles contracting harder against resistance. And you can do all the little light isometrics and squeezes in the world you want, but that doesn't stimulate muscle growth. Just because you feel a squeeze there, just because you're doing some smaller exercise and you feel a squeeze there, that doesn't mean that it's actually stimulating growth. How do we stimulate growth? Through progressive overload, right? Through progressive overload. You have to increase tension, you have to increase work. And squeezing a muscle with a light weight is not work, particularly at the top where your muscle is actually the strongest. You're not doing much of anything. You might feel it because you're squeezing it, but you know what? If I squeeze my chest right now, I can feel it. Do you think that's going to make it grow? No, you have to have progressive overload, and that progressive overload can be in the form of extra mechanical tension for more weight. It can be in the form of additional reps. It can be in the form of additional sets. So in other words, volume is a form of progressive overload, assuming you can recover from that additional volume. But you have to have progressive overload, and just squeezing a muscle where you think you're supposed to feel it, that isn't really doing anything. You might think it does. You can argue about it. Bodybuilders can argue about it all they want. But biomechanically speaking, that's not reality. It's not actually helping. It's not doing anything. These are silly exercises being thrown in there instead of doing nice, full, long range of motion exercises that'll work the whole chest. And by all means, look, if you feel that you need to do a smaller exercise because your delts and your triceps and everything else are growing faster than your chest and your chest is lagging and you want to do some sort of smaller exercise, whether it's flies with dumbbells or cables or whatever it is you want to do, that's fine. But you need to understand just as much of your inner chest is being worked at the bottom as it is the top, right? Because the fibers run this way all the way across, and there are muscle fibers in the inner chest that are being worked at the very bottom also. You need to be doing the whole thing. Like, you need to be doing the whole thing. Otherwise, you're actually shortchanging the potential growth. Just doing silliness is not really based on reality. And it doesn't matter that some guy says, well, this is what I've done and I've got results. Like, well, you've got a big overall chest. You're at a low body fat. There could be all sorts of other factors, genetics, drugs, everything else. But it's obviously overall development. It's obviously overall development in his case. The guy, again, has a big overall chest and he's at a low body fat. That's the reason he has that look. It has nothing at all to do with these smaller exercises. Because, again, that's not how the pecs even work. That's not what they do. That's not a realistic understanding of how the muscle fibers throughout the muscle even work. Again, was he talking about upper versus lower with some stuff? Okay, that would be a different story. He would have a point there. There is evidence for that. There's, again, biomechanics you can look at to determine that. That's reality. But inner versus outer chest, you can't actually train them separately like that. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.